She was the kind of woman who remembered your birthday without being reminded. The kind of woman who showed up at your door with a casserole dish and a warm smile on the worst day of your life, without you ever having to ask. She was the woman every neighborhood quietly depends on, the one holding everyone else together while quietly asking nothing in return. Her name was Carol Watkins. And on a Tuesday evening in October, in a quiet suburb outside of Columbus, Ohio, she said goodnight to her daughter over the phone, locked her front door, and was never seen alive again. Before we go any further, and I need you to stay with me on this, because this story is going to shake something loose inside of you. I want you to understand something right from the beginning. What happened to Carol Watkins was not a random act of violence. It was not a stranger from the shadows. It was not the result of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. What happened to Carol Watkins happened because she trusted someone. And that someone looked her in the eyes, accepted her kindness, sat at her kitchen table, and then made a decision that no human being with a conscience could ever fully explain. Before we go deeper into Carol's story, we want to hear from you. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Carol Watkins was 51 years old when she died. She had grown up in Westerville, Ohio, the middle child of 3 daughters born to a retired schoolteacher named Ruth and a soft-spoken postal worker named Gerald. People who knew Carol as a child described her the same way people described her as an adult. Generous to a fault, emotionally intelligent in a way that made people feel immediately seen and safe, and possessed of a laugh that could fill an entire room and make the walls themselves seem warmer. Her younger sister, Diane, once told a reporter that Carol was the kind of person who made you feel like you were the most important person in the world whenever she talked to you, and that she genuinely meant it every single time. Carol married her college sweetheart, a man named Robert Watkins, when she was 26. Robert worked in logistics and traveled frequently for work, which meant that for much of their marriage, Carol managed the home, raised their 2 children, a son, Tyler, and a daughter, Melissa, and built a life around community and connection. She was active in her church. She organized the neighborhood food drive every Thanksgiving. She was the first person to arrive and the last person to leave at every school event, every neighborhood gathering, every occasion that required someone to care enough to make it happen. The people who knew Carol best said she never did any of it for recognition. She did it because she genuinely believed that taking care of the people around you was the most important work a person could do. By the time Carol was in her late 40s, her marriage to Robert had quietly unraveled. The distance, both literal and emotional, had worn the relationship thin over years, and the two of them eventually separated without bitterness, co-parenting their grown children with the same quiet dignity they had tried to bring to everything else. Carol's friends watched the separation and marveled at how she handled it. She didn't fall apart. She didn't become bitter. She picked herself up, moved into a smaller house in a nearby subdivision called Meadow Ridge, started working full-time at a local medical billing office, and began the long, unglamorous, deeply human process of rebuilding a life from scratch. It was not easy. It was not fast. But Carol Watkins had always been stronger than anyone around her quite realized, and slowly, steadily, she found her footing again. Meadow Ridge was the kind of subdivision that feels both ordinary and quietly beautiful in the particular way that middle American neighborhoods can. Tree-lined streets, children on bikes in the summer, neighbors who waved from driveways. It was the kind of place where people left their cars unlocked and let their dogs run loose in the yard, and where a new face on the block was welcomed with a plate of cookies and a genuine invitation to come over for dinner. Carol had moved there because it reminded her of the neighborhood she had grown up in, and within 6 months of arriving, she had already become one of those people who made the street feel like a community rather than simply a collection of houses. It was in Meadow Ridge that Carol first met Gary Nolan. Gary lived 3 houses down, on the same side of the street. He was 54, recently relocated from Indianapolis after a job transfer, living alone in a house that seemed perpetually in the process of being unpacked. He was friendly enough, always willing to wave, always ready with a brief conversation over the fence, but he kept to himself in a way that was just slightly more pronounced than the neighborhood norm. Where Carol threw open her curtains in the morning and spent weekends on her front porch with a cup of coffee and whoever happened to walk by, Gary kept his blinds angled downward. Where Carol's driveway was routinely full of friends' cars and her daughter's overnight bags, and the organized chaos of a woman whose door was always open, Gary's driveway was typically empty. He was present in the neighborhood without being quite of it, and in the beginning, nobody thought very much about that. Plenty of people are private. Plenty of people take time to warm up. Plenty of people, when they are new somewhere, pull themselves inward while they find their footing. Carol, being Carol, was one of the first people to make a real effort with Gary Nolan. She brought him a plate of her pecan brownies, the ones her daughter always requested for Christmas, within the first 2 weeks of his arrival on their street. She introduced him to the neighbors on either side of him. She mentioned the farmers market on Saturday mornings and the community barbecue in June and the names of the best mechanics and the most reliable plumbers in the area. Gary accepted all of this with what seemed like genuine gratitude. He told Carol that moving had been hard, that he had left a lot behind in Indianapolis, and that it meant more than she knew to have someone make him feel welcome. Carol, who understood better than most people what it felt like to start over somewhere new, took him at his word. Their friendship developed slowly and, on Carol's part, entirely innocently. They were neighbors who occasionally helped each other out. Gary would bring in Carol's trash cans when she was running late in the mornings. Carol would text him when the neighborhood alert system sent a warning about a car break-in 2 streets over, because he had mentioned he hadn't set up the app yet. They had coffee together on a Sunday morning twice in those first few months, sitting on Carol's front porch in the autumn light, talking about nothing in particular, their kids, the neighborhood, the small, ordinary textures of their lives. Carol's daughter, Melissa, met Gary once during this period and later told investigators that he had seemed perfectly normal. Friendly, even. The word she used was unremarkable. She would later say, with a grief that never fully left her voice, that she wished to God she had paid more attention. What nobody in Carol's life knew during those months, what Carol herself had no reason to know, was that Gary Nolan had arrived in Meadow Ridge carrying something heavy and carefully concealed. His transfer from Indianapolis had not been voluntary. He had been asked, quietly and firmly, to leave his previous position at a distribution company after a female colleague filed a formal complaint against him for workplace harassment. The complaint had been settled out of court, under conditions of strict confidentiality, which meant that it left no public record, no searchable trail, nothing that a neighbor doing a casual internet search would ever find. The woman who filed the complaint, a woman named Jennifer, 38 years old, who had worked alongside Gary for nearly 4 years, described in her filing a pattern of behavior that began with warmth and friendliness and generosity and gradually, methodically shifted into something that made her feel trapped. She described a man who paid close attention, who remembered details, who made you feel special and seen, right up until the moment that dynamic became a form of control. Her attorney later said that Jennifer had told colleagues she felt like Gary had been studying her from the day they met, learning her rhythms, mapping her world, building a portrait of who she was so that he would know exactly where she was vulnerable. Jennifer's case went nowhere legally. The settlement paid her damages and required Gary to resign. It did not follow him to Columbus. It did not find its way to Meadow Ridge. It did not reach Carol Watkins, standing on her front porch with a plate of pecan brownies, extending the hand of a genuinely good woman to a man who had already shown, in another city, in another life, exactly what he was capable of. This is the part of the story that demands you sit with something uncomfortable, because it would be easy, at this point, to ask why Carol didn't see the warning signs. It would be easy to look back at the sequence of events and assume that the signals were there, visible, obvious, that a more cautious woman, a less trusting woman, a woman with sharper instincts, might have seen what was coming and protected herself. But that kind of thinking is not just unfair to Carol Watkins. It is factually wrong. The warning signs that would eventually seem obvious in hindsight were not obvious in real time, because Gary Nolan had spent years learning how to make sure they weren't. He understood, with a precision that is genuinely chilling, how to present himself as the kind of man that women like Carol felt safe around. He did not arrive in her life looking dangerous. He arrived looking lonely. And loneliness, in a kind woman's eyes, is not a threat. It's an invitation. By the spring following Gary's arrival on Meadow Ridge, something had shifted almost imperceptibly in the dynamic between him and Carol. The shift was subtle enough that Carol herself did not name it right away. She noticed it, the way you notice a draft from a window you cannot quite identify, a vague discomfort that you cannot locate precisely enough to address. Gary had begun to be more present than she had invited. He would appear at her door on evenings she had not mentioned she'd be home. He texted her more frequently than she texted him, and the texts had begun to carry a possessiveness that she could not quite articulate. Nothing explicit, nothing overtly threatening, but a quality of ownership that made her feel, on some quiet internal level, that she owed him something she had never agreed to give. He began making small comments about people she spent time with. A question here, a raised eyebrow there, a half-joke about a friend of hers that landed slightly wrong and left her with a feeling she couldn't shake for the rest of the day. Carol mentioned it to her best friend of 22 years, a woman named Brenda Holloway, sometime in late April. Not as a dramatic declaration, not as a cry for help, more in the way that women share the small, jagged pieces of their lives, in a parking lot after errands, in the 10 minutes before a phone call had to end, in the casual offhand manner that sometimes contains the most serious things. She told Brenda that Gary had started to give her a feeling she couldn't quite put into words. Brenda asked her to describe it. Carol thought about it for a moment and said, quietly, that he made her feel like she had to be careful. Brenda told her to trust her gut. Carol said she was probably overreacting. She said she'd been through a hard few years, and maybe her instincts were off. She said she'd keep her distance for a while and see if it helped. She said she'd talk to Brenda more about it later. There was no later. Not the kind Carol meant. On the evening of October the 14th, Carol Watkins left her medical billing office at her usual time, stopped at the grocery store on Fairfield Road. The receipt was later recovered, time-stamped at 6:47 in the evening, and drove home to Meadow Ridge. She called her daughter, Melissa, from the grocery store parking lot and talked for 11 minutes. Melissa later told detectives every detail of that call with the meticulous grief of someone who has replayed it thousands of times in the silence of the night. Carol had mentioned that she was tired. She had mentioned that the week had felt long. She had mentioned a good book she was in the middle of and said she was looking forward to a quiet evening. She said she loved Melissa. She said she'd call her on Sunday. She said goodnight. The call ended at 6:58 in the evening. The timeline reconstructed by detectives later established that Carol arrived home at approximately 7:15, pulled her car into the garage, and went inside. A neighbor 2 doors down, a retired teacher named Wallace, recalled seeing Carol's kitchen light come on at around 7:20 and thinking nothing of it, because Carol's kitchen light came on every evening at around that time. Wallace would later tell investigators that he had also noticed Gary Nolan's car parked not in his own driveway that night, but one street over, facing back toward Meadow Ridge, though at the time he had paid it no particular attention. It was just a car, just a man sitting in his car. Wallace would spend a very long time after Carol's death wishing he had thought to wonder why. Carol Watkins was reported missing the following Thursday morning, when she failed to show up for work for the 3rd consecutive day without contacting the office. Her supervisor, a woman named Patricia, had tried calling Carol's cell phone repeatedly over the previous 2 days and had received no answer. On the 3rd day, she called Melissa directly. Melissa told investigators that when Patricia's name came up on her phone at 8 o'clock on a Thursday morning, she felt something drop inside her chest before she even answered. She said she already knew, in the way that daughters sometimes know, that something was wrong. She called the Columbus Police Department from the parking lot of the school where she taught 3rd grade, her hands shaking so badly she had to dial twice. The first officers to arrive at Carol's home on Meadow Ridge found the kind of scene that makes experienced law enforcement professionals go quiet for a moment before they speak. The front door was locked. The car was in the garage. The kitchen light was still on. Inside, Carol's groceries, the ones she had purchased that Tuesday evening, were still sitting on the kitchen counter, mostly unpacked. Her phone was on the kitchen table. Her book was on the couch, face down, still open to the page she had been on. The reading glasses she always left folded on top of her book were missing, and Carol was gone. There was no sign of a break-in, no sign of a struggle in the visible areas of the home. Just the terrible, suffocating stillness of a life interrupted so abruptly that the grocery bags were still sitting on the counter, waiting for hands that would never come back to finish putting things away. Detective Linda Pruitt, the lead investigator assigned to Carol Watkins' case, was a 17-year veteran of the Columbus Police Department's Homicide Division. She was known among her colleagues for a quality that is rarer than it sounds in detective work, a genuine resistance to the obvious answer. Where other investigators sometimes reached early for the most available explanation and began fitting evidence around it, Linda Pruitt had a habit of sitting with a case for longer than was comfortable before allowing herself to form conclusions. She would later say that the first time she walked through Carol's home, she felt what she described as a deliberate quiet. Not the quiet of a place where nothing bad had happened, but the quiet of a place where something bad had been carefully arranged to look like nothing had happened at all. That distinction, the difference between a scene and a staged scene, was something Pruitt's instincts registered immediately, even before the forensic evidence gave her the language to name it. The investigation's early days moved in multiple directions simultaneously, as homicide investigations do. Carol's ex-husband, Robert, was located, interviewed, and placed conclusively at a work conference in Phoenix, Arizona, with over 40 witnesses and a credit card trail that accounted for every hour of the relevant time frame. He was eliminated within 72 hours. Carol's adult son, Tyler, was living in Portland, Oregon, with his family and had not been to Columbus in nearly 4 months. He was eliminated as well. Investigators spoke to Carol's colleagues, her church community, her friends from the neighborhood, the cashier at the grocery store who had checked out Carol's items that Tuesday evening and remembered her as having seemed perfectly normal, perfectly fine, perfectly present, just a woman picking up groceries on a Tuesday, entirely unaware that she was 7 minutes from the last ordinary moment of her life. It was in the second week of the investigation that a patrol officer named Marcus Webb, working a door-to-door canvass of the Meadow Ridge neighborhood, spoke with Wallace, the retired teacher who had noticed Gary Nolan's car parked on a side street the evening Carol disappeared. Wallace mentioned it almost as an aside, the way people mention things they are not sure are relevant, apologetically, with the kind of disclaimer that says I'm probably wasting your time, but Officer Webb wrote it in his notes. He flagged it for Detective Pruitt. And Detective Linda Pruitt, who had a particular talent for the significance of small things, asked to speak with Gary Nolan the following morning. Gary Nolan presented himself to Detective Pruitt with the practiced composure of a man who had thought carefully about how he wanted this conversation to go. He was cooperative. He was friendly. He expressed concern for Carol, genuine seeming concern, the kind delivered with the right proportions of worry and neighborly sadness. He told Pruitt that he and Carol were friends, good friends, that he had seen her in passing earlier that week but hadn't spoken to her at length in a few days. He mentioned the car on the side street as though the question didn't concern him particularly, said he had stopped to take a phone call, didn't want to idle in his own driveway with the engine running because of the noise, and had pulled around the corner to talk without bothering anyone. It was an entirely unremarkable explanation, delivered in an entirely unremarkable way. Pruitt thanked him for his time. She watched him walk away. She wrote 2 words in her notebook. She circled them. She did not share them with anyone on her team for another 4 days, because Linda Pruitt was not a woman who let her instincts overrun her evidence. But she also did not stop thinking about Gary Nolan from the moment he left that interview room. The break in the case came from Carol's phone, which forensic technicians had been working through methodically since the first day. Carol's phone records showed, in the 2 months before her disappearance, an increasing volume of incoming calls and text messages from Gary Nolan's number. 43 texts in the final month alone, the vast majority of them sent by Gary, with increasingly short responses from Carol, and then, in the final 2 weeks, no responses at all. The forensic technician who compiled this data noted in her report that the pattern of communication showed a clear and consistent one-sidedness that had intensified sharply in the final 30 days. She flagged it for Detective Pruitt with a sticky note that said simply, "Look at the gap." The gap the technician was referring to was the 14-day period in which Carol had stopped responding to Gary's messages entirely, and Gary had continued sending them anyway. 12 messages over 14 days, unanswered, until the last one, sent on the morning of October the 14th, the day Carol disappeared, that read, in its entirety, "I know you're home." When Detective Pruitt showed that message to her supervisor, the room went quiet in the particular way rooms do when everyone in them understands simultaneously that the question of who has just changed. Gary Nolan was brought in for a second interview. This time, Detective Pruitt did not ask him about the car on the side street. She placed a printed copy of the text message record on the table between them, face up, without saying a word, and watched his face. And Gary Nolan, who had spent the better part of 2 weeks performing the role of a concerned and cooperative neighbor, looked down at that paper and made the first visible crack in the composure he had constructed so carefully. It was small. It was brief. It was the kind of thing that only someone watching very closely would have caught. But Linda Pruitt was someone who watched very closely, and she caught it. The interrogation that followed lasted 9 hours across 2 sessions. Gary's attorney arrived after the first hour and advised him to say nothing further. Gary said nothing further for the first session. He returned the following morning, alone, without his attorney, and asked to speak to Detective Pruitt directly. The desk sergeant who signed him in that morning later said he had never seen a man who looked the way Gary Nolan looked that day. Not frightened, not remorseful, but depleted. Like something had been using up enormous amounts of energy inside him for a very long time, and he had finally run out of the will to keep feeding it. He sat down across from Detective Pruitt. He looked at the table between them for a very long moment, and then he told her what he had done. What Gary Nolan confessed to on that Friday morning in November is a story that demands to be told with the weight it deserves, and also with the restraint that Carol Watkins' memory deserves, because she was a real woman and not a chapter in someone else's story of consequence. Gary had gone to Carol's home on the evening of October the 14th after she had stopped responding to his messages. He had knocked on the back door, the door that opened off the kitchen, the door that Carol sometimes left unlocked in the early evenings because Meadow Ridge had always felt safe. And Carol had answered it because Carol, even with all of her growing unease, had not yet reached the place where she could look at a man she knew and simply not open the door. She let him in because she was a good woman who had not yet learned, in the brutal and unfair way that some women are forced to learn it, that goodness and safety are not the same thing. What happened inside that house in the 30 minutes that followed is what Gary Nolan confessed to. He had gone there with the intention of forcing a confrontation, of demanding that Carol explain why she had been pulling away from him, why she had stopped responding, why she seemed to be distancing herself in a way he experienced not as her right, but as a form of rejection he had decided he was owed no explanation for. The confrontation had escalated in the way that confrontations escalate when one person has decided in advance that they are willing to do whatever it takes to feel in control of an outcome. Carol had asked him to leave. She had been frightened. She had tried to get to her phone. She had not succeeded. Gary Nolan was a large man, and Carol Watkins was 51 years old and alone in her home, and the geography of that moment, what it meant for him to be standing between her and her phone, between her and her door, between her and any possibility of help, is something that should make every single person watching this feel the full weight of what it means to live in a body that the world has decided is negotiable. Carol Watkins died inside her own home, in her own kitchen, within feet of groceries she had stopped to pick up because she was tired and she wanted a quiet evening, and she had a book she was looking forward to, and she was going to call Melissa on Sunday. She was not found in her home because Gary Nolan, after taking her life, had spent a methodical and deeply disturbing amount of time making sure that there would be nothing immediately visible to alarm the neighbors, that the scene would read, at least initially, at least to the casual observer, as simply a woman who had gone somewhere. He had locked the door behind him. He had walked back to his car parked around the corner and driven calmly, at the speed limit, back into the neighborhood and into his own driveway. He had, by his own account in the confession, slept that night. Carol was found on the 5th day after her disappearance, in a heavily wooded area off Walnut Creek Road, approximately 9 miles from Meadow Ridge. She had been placed there in the dark, in the cold October ground, in the terrible and indifferent way that people who have decided another person is a problem rather than a human being dispose of that problem. The detective who accompanied the search team to the recovery site said afterward that she had to sit in her car for 15 minutes before she could drive home. She said she did not cry. She said she just sat there in the dark and thought about Carol's kitchen and the groceries on the counter and the book face down on the couch. She said she thought about a woman who had moved to a new neighborhood and brought pecan brownies to a man who was lonely, because that was who Carol was, and because Carol believed, as good people do, that kindness given freely would come back to her in kind. The formal charges against Gary Nolan were filed 3 days after his confession, on a Monday morning in early November. He was charged with first-degree murder, unlawful restraint, and abuse of a corpse. The last charge carrying its own particular and awful weight when you understand what it says about the state of mind required to do what he did after Carol died. His attorney entered a not guilty plea on his behalf at arraignment, citing the circumstances of the confession and raising questions about the conditions under which it had been obtained. Detective Pruitt spent the next 4 months building a case brick by methodical brick, because she understood that a confession obtained by a man sitting voluntarily in an interview room at 8 in the morning, without coercion and of his own choice, was legally solid. But she was not a woman who left anything to chance when a woman's life was asking to be properly accounted for. The trial of Gary Nolan opened in March, 5 months after Carol's disappearance, in a courtroom that was standing room only from the first day. Carol's daughter, Melissa, sat in the second row behind the prosecution table every single day of those proceedings, in the same seat, with the same quiet and devastating composure that the journalists covering the case would later write about at length. She did not cry visibly in the courtroom. She watched. She listened. She held her brother Tyler's hand during the days when what was being described was hardest to hear, and she kept her eyes on Gary Nolan with an unflinching steadiness that more than one courtroom observer described as the bravest thing they had ever seen. The defense's strategy, over the course of 3 weeks, attempted to characterize Gary Nolan's actions as the unplanned, crisis-driven behavior of a man in acute psychological distress. A man who had become emotionally dependent on Carol in a way he had not understood, whose sense of rejection had triggered a break he had not been capable of preventing. The defense called 2 psychologists who testified about attachment disorders and the neurological impacts of perceived abandonment. The prosecution dismantled those arguments with the careful precision of people who had Carol's 14-day text message silence and Gary's unanswered messages and the final message, "I know you're home," to remind the jury that planning does not require months of preparation. Sometimes it requires only the decision, made in the last conscious moment before action, that you are willing to do whatever it takes. The jury was out for 6 hours. The verdict, when it came, was guilty on all counts. When the verdict was read, Melissa Watkins sat very still for a long moment in that courtroom, and then she closed her eyes. Her brother Tyler, beside her, put his arm around her. Brenda Holloway, Carol's best friend of 22 years, who had been sitting 3 rows back every day of the trial, was one of the few people in that room who did cry, openly, without apology, the way someone cries when they have been holding something for too long and the body finally decides it cannot hold it anymore. She told a reporter outside the courthouse afterward that she kept thinking about that parking lot conversation, about Carol saying she didn't know how to put it into words, about Carol saying she was probably overthinking it, about Carol saying she'd talk about it more later. Brenda said she had replayed that conversation every day since October the 14th, turning it over and over in her mind, asking herself what she should have said differently, what she could have done, whether there was a version of that moment in which she had pushed harder, listened longer, refused to let Carol minimize what she was feeling. She said the grief counselor she had been seeing since October told her that guilt was the mind's way of searching for control in a situation where control was never available to her. She said she understood that intellectually. She said it didn't help. Gary Nolan was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole on a Wednesday morning in April. He stood at the sentencing with the same depleted stillness that the desk sergeant had described on the morning he came in to confess, and he said a single sentence to the courtroom before the judge brought down the gavel. He said he was sorry. He said it looking at the floor. Melissa Watkins, given the opportunity to speak at sentencing as the victim's family representative, looked at Gary Nolan directly and said something that the courthouse reporters would quote in full in every article they wrote about the proceedings. She said, "My mother spent her whole life making the people around her feel safe. She deserved to feel that way herself. And I will spend the rest of my life making sure that this story, her story, is told loudly enough that people who hear it never have to wonder whether the quiet feeling of not being safe is real. It is real. It has always been real. Believe the feeling. Tell someone. Do not wait." The courtroom was silent when Melissa finished speaking. Gary Nolan received his sentence and was led from the room. Melissa walked out of the courthouse into an April morning with her brother on one side and Brenda Holloway on the other, and she stood on the courthouse steps and looked up at the sky for a long moment. Brenda would later say she did not know what Melissa was thinking in that moment. She said it felt like the kind of private conversation a daughter has with her mother that no one else is meant to hear. The house on Meadow Ridge is still there. Someone else lives in it now, a young family with a dog and a yard full of bikes and the ordinary, beautiful noise of children. And the kitchen light comes on in the evenings just the way it used to, and the street looks the way it always looked, quiet and lined with trees, the kind of place that feels safe because the people on it trusted each other. Gary Nolan's house sold 6 months after his sentencing. The new owners painted it a different color. The neighbors on either side both said it was a relief. Carol's pecan brownie recipe was printed in the Meadow Ridge community newsletter the Christmas after she died, at the request of several neighbors who had been the recipients of that particular kindness over the years. Brenda Holloway submitted it. She included a note at the bottom that said simply, "Carol always said the secret ingredient was that she meant it. Make them for someone you love." That's what she would have wanted. There is a particular kind of evil that does not announce itself. It does not arrive with visible warning signs and a set of symptoms that allow the people around it to prepare. It arrives looking like loneliness. It arrives looking like gratitude. It arrives looking like the perfectly ordinary face of a neighbor who accepts a plate of brownies at the door and says thank you and seems, to every available measure of human perception, to be exactly what he appears to be. And that is the truth about what happened to Carol Watkins that demands the most from us, not the facts of the crime, disturbing and devastating as they are, but the recognition that the systems we have built for keeping people safe depend entirely on the assumption that the most dangerous people will be, in some way, visible. And sometimes they are not. Sometimes they look just like Gary Nolan, standing in the autumn light on Meadow Ridge, perfectly ordinary, entirely unremarkable, already paying close attention in the specific way of a man who has decided, long before you realize it, that your life is something he has a claim on. Carol Watkins said it herself, in the parking lot, in April, in the offhand way of a woman who did not yet understand the full weight of what she was describing. "He makes me feel like I have to be careful." She said it. She named it. She told someone. And the world, as it so often does, moved on without pausing long enough to understand what she was actually saying. So we are pausing now. We are saying her name. We are telling her story the way it deserves to be told, with the full, unsparing, tender weight of a life that mattered completely and was taken in a single moment by a single act of cruelty that its perpetrator will spend the rest of his life inside a prison cell with. Because that is what a single moment of cruelty costs. Not just a life, not just a family, not just a neighborhood that will never feel entirely the same again. It costs every version of the future that the person taken was in the process of building. It costs Melissa's Sunday phone calls. It costs Tyler's visits home at Christmas. It costs Brenda Holloway's 23 years of friendship and every conversation they should have had in the years after. It costs every person who ever sat on Carol Watkins' front porch and felt, for an hour, like the most important person in the world. It costs all of that, every bit of it, and it does not stop costing. A single moment of cruelty, a lifetime of regret, not just for the man sitting in that cell, but for every single person left behind in the silence where Carol used to be. If there is one thing this story asks of you, let it be this. When someone you love tells you they don't know how to put something into words, sit down. Stay. Ask another question. And if someone tells you they feel like they have to be careful, believe them. Do not let them talk themselves out of it. Do not let the moment pass. Because sometimes the moment that passes is the only one you get. Carol Watkins deserved a later. We owe it to her memory to make sure the people in our lives always have one.